The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and desert dust. Maria Salazar sat rigid in the wooden chair, her calloused hands folded in her lap, while the attorney shuffled through documents with the weary efficiency of a man who had seen too many small tragedies. "Mrs. Salazar, I'm afraid your husband left very little," he said, not unkindly. "The ranch in Cibola County. That's all there is." Maria nodded slowly. She had known Carlos kept secrets, but she had imagined debt, not this. The Arroyo Seco Ranch was a name whispered with pity in the cantinas of Socorro, New Mexico. 40 years abandoned, no water, no roads, just cracked adobe walls and rattlesnakes. "How much land?" she asked quietly. 320 acres. But ma'am, nobody's worked that ground since the 1880s. The county tried to auction it twice. No bidders. He pushed the deed across the desk. You could refuse the inheritance. Walk away clean. Maria looked at the faded ink, the Spanish land grant seal barely visible beneath decades of bureaucratic stamps. She was 53 years old, her widow with $72 in her purse, and a son studying engineering in Albuquerque on scholarship money she'd earned cleaning hotel rooms. "I'll take it," she said. The lawyer sighed. "Mrs. Salazar, that land will cost you more in back taxes than it's worth. Then I'll pay the taxes." She signed the papers with her maiden name written carefully beneath her married one, the way her grandmother had taught her. "Never forget where you come from." The ranch sat 23 miles southwest of Socorro, accessible only by a rutted track that hadn't seen grading since the Roosevelt administration. When Maria finally reached it in her borrowed pickup, the November sun was slanting low across the Magdalena Mountains, turning the desert the color of old blood. The main house was a ruin. Roof beams showed through collapsed vigas. The well stood dry and choked with tumbleweeds, but the walls were thick, 3 feet of adobe and riverstone, and the doors still hung square in their frames. She walked the property line as the light died, her boots crushing brittle saltbush. The arroyo cut deep through the eastern section, exposing layers of red and white stone. At the northern boundary, she found the remains of a Spanish mission chapel, just 4 walls and an empty doorway facing east. That night, she slept in the truck bed under a wool blanket, listening to coyotes and the wind moving through Ocotillo. At dawn, she began to clean. The townspeople came within a week. First, the tax assessor, a paunchy man named Garrett, who looked at her with undisguised contempt. "You're the Salazar widow? Lady, you can't live out here. No power, no water. This is federal land dispute territory, grazing rights going back to Spanish crown grants. You'll be in court for years." Maria swept dust from the doorway. "The deed is clear. Recorded 1842, confirmed by the Surveyor General 1889. I checked." Garrett's face reddened. "You checked? With who?" "The Territorial Archives in Santa Fe. I can read Spanish, Mr. Garrett. My family has been in New Mexico since 1680. He left without another word, but Maria knew he would be back. The neighbors arrived next. Tom Driscoll owned the largest cattle operation in the county, 20,000 acres of grazing lease. He pulled up in a new Ford, his foreman beside him. "Mrs. Salazar, I'm here to make you an offer. $5,000 for your section, cash money. You could get yourself a decent place in town." Maria set down her hammer. She had been reframing the doorway, salvaging old timbers from the collapsed outbuildings. "It's not for sale." Driscoll smiled the way men smile when they think they're being patient. "Ma'am, be reasonable. This land hasn't produced a thing in 60 years. The well's dry, the grazing's worthless. I'm offering you more than it's worth out of respect for your situation." "I appreciate that, Mr. Driscoll, but I'm staying." The foreman spat tobacco juice. "Lady's got some sand, boss. Shame she's got no sense." They left, but Maria noticed they lingered at the arroyo, looking down into the cut where the old Spanish trail wound through the property. That evening, she lit a kerosene lamp and spread the original land grant documents on the floor. The Spanish was archaic but clear. The ranch had been part of a royal grant to a minor nobleman, Don Felipe Cortés de Mendoza, in 1751. It had passed through various hands before being sold to an American surveyor in 1842, but there was a notation in the margin, barely legible. "Cella la entrada. Orden real. Seal the entrance. Royal order." Maria traced the words with her finger. Entrance to what? Chapter 2. What lies beneath? The old man appeared on a Tuesday morning, walking up the arroyo with a stick and a canvas bag. He was Navajo, his face creased like the land itself, wearing a shirt that had been washed and mended so many times the original color was anyone's guess. "You're living in the cursed place," he said by way of greeting. Maria was hauling stones to repair the well casing. She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. "If you're here to warn me off, you can save your breath." "I'm not here to warn. I'm here because you're the first person in 40 years who actually stayed." He sat on a rock, setting his bag beside him. "My grandfather worked for the man who owned this place, before it was abandoned." "What was his name?" "Samuel Beckett. Not the Irish writer. This was a different man. He bought the ranch in 1880, started digging. Looking for something the Spanish had hidden. Maria felt a chill despite the heat. Did he find it? He found enough to get himself killed, him and his 2 sons, found dead in that chapel, all 3 of them. Sheriff ruled it accidental, gas pocket, they said. But my grandfather said the bodies looked wrong, like they'd seen something that stopped their hearts." "That's quite a story." The old man shrugged. "You don't have to believe it, but you should know that Driscoll's been buying up every parcel around this section for 20 years. He's patient, but he wants this land bad enough to wait for you to give up or die trying." He stood, shouldering his bag. "There's a reason the Spanish sealed something here. Maybe it should stay sealed." After he left, Maria descended into the arroyo with a pickaxe and a Coleman lantern. The walls rose 15 feet on either side, exposing geological time, layers of sandstone and shale, ancient riverbeds compressed into stone. The old Spanish trail was still visible as a faint depression, worn smooth by centuries of use. She followed it upstream, watching the walls narrow. Where the arroyo bent sharply north, she saw it, a section of wall that didn't match the surrounding stone. It had been built, not eroded. Fitted blocks of limestone, each one precisely cut, filled with mortar that had turned to concrete over the centuries. She touched the surface. Cool, almost cold, despite the desert heat. It took her 3 days to break through. She worked at dawn and dusk, when the sun wasn't murderous, chipping away mortar with a mason's chisel and a 5-pound hammer. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. Her hands, already rough from hotel work, grew harder still. On the 3rd evening, the wall gave way. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but beyond it stretched a tunnel cut into the bedrock. The air that emerged smelled of minerals and thyme. Maria lit the lantern and stepped inside. The tunnel ran level for 30 feet, then descended steeply. The walls showed tool marks, parallel grooves from picks and chisels. Every 10 feet, there were niches cut into the stone, and in each niche sat a ceramic oil lamp, the kind Spanish miners used in the colonial period. The tunnel ended in a chamber. Maria held the lantern high. The room was perhaps 20 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling supported by dressed stone. And covering every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, were shelves carved into the living rock. On those shelves sat boxes, hundreds of them, small wooden chests bound in iron, each one marked with the seal of the Spanish crown. Maria opened the nearest box with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were documents, legal papers, written in formal Spanish on parchment that cracked at her touch. She lifted one carefully to the light. It was a record of tribute payments, gold and silver, extracted from mines throughout New Spain, collected by royal officials and hidden. Not sent to Madrid, hidden here in this sealed chamber, while false manifests were sent to the crown. She opened another box. More documents, bills of lading, mining surveys, and beneath those smaller leather pouches heavy with weight. She opened one. Gold coins spilled into her palm, catching the lamplight. Spanish doubloons, pristine and perfect, as bright as the day they were minted. The chamber wasn't a hiding place, it was a vault, a secret treasury built by corrupt officials who had been skimming the king's fifth for decades, creating a private fortune they intended to retrieve after the chaos of Mexican independence. But something had happened. The officials had died, or fled, or been killed. The secret had died with them. Until now. Chapter 3. The Price of Truth. Maria told no one. She sealed the entrance with stones and mortar, working through the night to make it look natural. Then she drove to Albuquerque to see her son. David Salazar was in his final year at the university, thin and intense, with his father's careful eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They met at a coffee shop near campus. "Mama, what's wrong? You look like you haven't slept." She told him everything. The tunnel, the chamber, the documents and gold. When she finished, David sat very still, his coffee growing cold. "You can't tell anyone," he said finally. "Not yet. If Driscoll finds out, he'll file a lawsuit claiming mineral rights. If the state finds out, they'll invoke eminent domain. The federal government could claim its archaeological heritage." "So what do I do?" "You document everything. Photographs, translations. We need to establish provenance and legal ownership before anyone else knows it exists." He pulled out a notebook. "I have a friend in the history department who specializes in Spanish colonial administration, and I know a lawyer who handles property disputes. They worked through the night, planning. David would research the legal precedents. Maria would photograph and catalogue the contents of the chamber. They would build an airtight case for ownership before revealing the discovery. But secrets have a way of bleeding into the light. Maria returned to the ranch to find her well poisoned. Someone had dumped diesel fuel down the shaft, contaminating the water table. It would cost thousands to clean if it could be cleaned at all. 2 days later, cattle appeared on her land. Driscoll's cattle, 50 head, tearing up the sparse grass and fouling the arroyo. When Maria called the sheriff, he took 3 days to respond. "Mrs. Salazar, this is open range country. Cattle wander. You want to keep them out, you build a fence. This is criminal trespass." The sheriff, a man named Curry with a belly that tested his belt, smiled without warmth. "That's a civil matter, ma'am. Take it up with a lawyer." The pressure escalated. Her truck tires were slashed. Supplies she'd ordered in Socorro were mysteriously lost. The county suddenly discovered building code violations and threatened to condemn the property. But Maria had learned patience from her grandmother, who had outlasted drought, depression, and 3 difficult husbands. She continued working. Each morning she photographed another section of the chamber. Each evening she translated another document, her high school Spanish and a dictionary slowly revealing the scope of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. The officials had been systematic. For 30 years, from 1740 to 1770, they had diverted 20% of all precious metals mined in New Mexico and southern Colorado. The accumulated wealth was staggering, perhaps $10 million in period value. In modern terms, adjusted for gold prices and historical significance, the collection could be worth 50 million or more. But Maria understood something the greedy officials hadn't. The real value wasn't the gold, it was the truth. These documents proved that the colonial administration in New Mexico had been thoroughly corrupt, that the Spanish crown had been systematically defrauded, and that local indigenous populations had been taxed and worked to support not just imperial policy, but personal enrichment. It was a historical revelation that would rewrite textbooks. In December, Driscoll made his final offer. He arrived with his lawyer, a sharp woman in a business suit who looked profoundly uncomfortable in the desert setting. "Mrs. Salazar, my client is prepared to offer $20,000 for your property. That's 4 times the assessed value. It's more than fair." Maria was measuring the chapel doorway, planning repairs. She didn't stop working. "Not interested." Driscoll's face darkened. "Lady, you're being foolish. This land will break you. The taxes alone are paid, current through next year. The well's ruined. I'll haul water. You can't live out here alone. It's not safe." Maria turned then, the measuring tape still in her hand. "Mr. Driscoll, are you threatening me?" The lawyer intervened quickly. "Of course not. Mr. Driscoll is simply concerned for your welfare." "How considerate." Maria folded the measuring tape with precise motions. "I wonder, Mr. Driscoll, what's your interest in this particular piece of worthless desert? You have 20,000 acres. Why do you need my 320? Something flickered in Driscoll's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition that he'd been caught. Just being neighborly, he muttered. They left, but Maria knew the end was approaching. Driscoll was running out of patience and subtle tactics. Whatever came next would be direct. She wasn't wrong. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The fire started just after midnight. Maria woke to the smell of smoke and saw orange light flickering through the gaps in the adobe walls. Someone had piled brush against the north side of the house and set it ablaze. She grabbed her truck keys and ran. The old Ford started on the third try, and she backed away from the burning structure, watching flames climb toward the roof beams. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, 45 minutes later, the house was lost. The fire chief, a weathered man named Gutierrez, walked the perimeter with a flashlight. "Looks like arson, Mrs. Salazar. You got any enemies?" "I have neighbors who want my land." "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime." Gutierrez sighed. "I'll file a report, but without evidence." Maria knew how it would end. The report would be filed and forgotten. The county would pressure her to sell. She would be the crazy widow who refused to see reason, unless she changed the game entirely. She called David that night from a motel in Socorro. "It's time we go public." He arrived the next morning with his history professor, Dr. Catherine Walsh, and a documentary filmmaker named Roberts, who'd made his reputation filming archaeological discoveries. They descended into the chamber with professional lighting and calibrated cameras. Dr. Walsh's hands shook as she examined the first document. "My God, this is pristine. The signatures alone. These are officials whose correspondence we know from archives in Seville, but we've never had direct evidence of their activities in New Mexico. They worked for 3 days, photographing every box, every document, cataloging coins and artifacts. Roberts filmed everything, capturing Maria's story alongside the historical revelation. On the 4th day, they held a press conference in Albuquerque. Maria stood before television cameras and newspaper reporters, flanked by Dr. Walsh and a team of lawyers David had assembled. She told the story simply: the inheritance, the discovery, the documentation, and the harassment. "This chamber represents one of the most significant historical finds in New Mexico history," Dr. Walsh explained to the cameras. "It provides documentary evidence of corruption in colonial administration, proves the existence of mining operations we'd only theorized about, and contains artifacts of immense cultural value." The lawyers outlined the legal position. The discovery was made on private property, properly deeded and taxed. The contents were historical artifacts subject to state and federal heritage laws, but ownership questions would be resolved through proper legal channels, not intimidation. A reporter asked, "What about the gold?" Maria answered, "The gold belongs to history. Whatever its monetary value, its historical value is greater. It should be in a museum where everyone can see it and learn from it." The story went national within hours. By evening, the ranch was surrounded by state police protecting it from looters and curiosity seekers. Federal marshals arrived to secure the chamber. Teams from the Smithsonian and the National Park Service began preliminary surveys. Tom Driscoll's empire began to crumble within a week. Investigators discovered he'd been using his political connections to suppress land titles and force sales through intimidation. The state attorney general opened a criminal investigation. The county officials who'd been helping him quietly resigned. The reckoning was thorough and relentless. 3 months later, on a clear March morning, Maria stood in the chapel she'd spent the winter restoring. The roof was new, traditional vigas and latillas done the old way. The walls were replastered with adobe mixed from the same arroyo that had hidden the Spanish vault. David was there, having taken a semester off to help with negotiations. Dr. Walsh was there, overseeing the careful removal of artifacts to a climate-controlled facility at the university, and a delegation from the State Historic Preservation Office was there to designate the ranch a protected historical site. The settlement had been generous. Maria retained ownership of the property, which would be maintained as a living historical site with her as the resident caretaker. The artifacts would be jointly owned by the state and the Salazar family, with provisions for museum display and academic research. The monetary value of the gold would be split, half to fund New Mexico schools, half to establish a scholarship program for students from rural communities. And Maria would receive a modest salary, enough to live comfortably and maintain the property. A reporter from the Santa Fe New Mexican interviewed her in the restored chapel. "Do you feel vindicated?" he asked. Maria considered the question. Through the open doorway she could see the desert she'd come to love, the hard, honest land that asked nothing but truth from those who tried to live on it. "I feel like I did what needed doing," as she said. "My husband left me this land for a reason. Maybe he knew somehow what was here, or maybe he just knew I'd be stubborn enough to stay and find out." "What will you do now?" "Keep living. Keep learning. This place has more stories to tell." She smiled, a rare expression that made her look younger. The Spanish officials who built that vault thought they were so clever, hiding wealth for themselves while pretending to serve the crown. But truth has a way of surfacing. You can bury it for centuries, but eventually someone comes along who's too stubborn or too poor or too honest to let sleeping lies rest. The reporter scribbled in his notebook, "That's quite a philosophy." "It's not philosophy. It's just life on the frontier. The desert keeps everything, secrets, bones, gold, but it gives them back to those who have the patience to listen." After the reporters left, Maria walked the property line as the sun set behind the Magdalenas. The land looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she understood it. Every arroyo and outcrop, every plant and stone, was part of a story that stretched back centuries. She had inherited a worthless ranch and found a fortune, but more than that, she had found her purpose. Some people were meant to discover things, others were meant to protect them. Maria Salazar, widow and housekeeper, had become both. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and creosote. Somewhere in the distance, her coyote sang, and in the restored chapel a lamp burned, not for God or gold, but for truth which outlasts both.